Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. Welcome to the Imagine Otherwise podcast, which is produced by Ideas on Fire, an academic editing and consulting agency helping progressive, interdisciplinary scholars write awesome texts, enliven public conversations, and create more just worlds. This week's episode is brought to you by our Grad School Rockstar program and Dissertation Rockstar Bootcamp. Enrollment for both are now open for spring 2017. Both of these programs help progressive, interdisciplinary scholars, like those featured on this podcast, create awesome work, build accountability and community for their projects, and rock their interdisciplinary careers. If you or someone you know is a grad student who wants to create a regular writing routine, stop drowning in email, don't we all, prioritize self-care, and actually finish their dissertation alongside other social justice-oriented scholars, you can go to ideasonfire.net to find out more.
This is episode 29, and my guest today is Tala Khanmalek. Tala is a postdoctoral research associate in the American Studies and Gender and Sexuality Studies programs at Princeton University. She completed her PhD in the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of California, Berkeley, with a designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality studies. She was also a visiting scholar at the University of California, Santa Cruz's Science and Justice Research Center. Tala's work, both within and outside of academia, calls attention to how various forms of storytelling expose the intimate impacts of health disparities and their institutionalized roots in historical patterns of discrimination. She has founded, directed, and participated in a wide range of community-based projects in the Bay Area, including the Cultural Conservancy, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts Body Politic Think Tank, the Healing Circle Collective, the Niroga Institute's Integral Health Fellowship Program, and Women's Circle. She's also a blogger for Swana Story Recollection, a digital archive of medicine stories from Southwest Asia and North Africa. In addition to being a creative writer herself, Tala is a sailor and has been involved with projects that highlight the role of water in healing, disability, and social justice activism. She's currently working on her first book manuscript, Living Laboratories, which we talk about in the interview, and establishing a community-based organization called Sailing for Social Justice that further links the sea to social justice movements through sailing. Tala is here today to talk about how academics can incorporate healing justice and disability justice into academic workflows, how a holistic approach to graduate school enabled her to create social justice projects, and what a healing justice and disability justice-based world might look like. Thank you so much for being with us, Tala.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you're currently working on your first book manuscript, which is very exciting. And that's called Living Laboratories, Remapping the Legacy of Experiments in American Empire. What's that book about?
So my first book project, Living Laboratories, in kind of very broad terms, is about how science and medicine have shaped and also been shaped by histories of slavery, colonialism, and empire to kind of determine the boundaries of human existence. So in this book project, I explore that by looking at what I call a living laboratory, which is a transnational site of state-sanctioned medical experimentation on populations that are deemed to harbor disease. And in the book, I look at 4 different, though deeply conceptually and historically interconnected living laboratories from the mid-18th to the mid-19th century. And most importantly, I look at how, I look at these sites through the scientific archive, but I also pair that archive with women of color feminist texts of the late 20th century and look at how these texts kind of reframe this legacy of living laboratories for our present.
Can you give us an example of one of those living laboratories that you look at?
Sure. So one of them is actually the El Paso immigration station at the U.S.-Mexico border. And that in that chapter of the book, I pair archives on the disinfection plant at that site that was operating from the early 1900s, way into way past the mid 19th century, and actually pair those archives with Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands to think about the medical experimentation that happened there in that disinfection plant.
This interest in health, in wellness, and in the kind of the violence that's wrapped up in how we think of health and wellness, given histories of colonialism, it seems to play out across your various projects, which is really fantastic. So clearly, here's a scholarly example of how you explore this. But you've also been really active in community organizations that focus on healing justice. You've worked with the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in the Bay Area, their body politic think tank, which is such a cool name. You've also worked with the Healing Clinic Collective, the Cultural how do you say that word?
Conservatory.
Thank you. Guardians of the Water Program.
We both got it wrong.
And you're also the founder of Women's Circle. So just to kind of start off, what is healing justice? And then maybe you could talk about what that means for you and why you think it's so important to do this kind of work.
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you so much for asking. The first thing that came to mind when I was reflecting on this question is that a few years ago in 2013, I was the executive editor of this academic journal called 1969. And I edited a special issue on healing justice. And actually in the outro to that issue, I wrote, I don't know what healing justice means. Even after this whole process, I don't know what it means. And actually, that's precisely one of the things I love about healing justice is that it to some extent resists fixed definitions. And I feel like that really actually parallels my lived experience as a chronically ill femme of color. But, having said that, there are some foundational healing justice principles. And I like to refer always back to those outlined by Kara Page, who in 2010 wrote this piece called Reflections from Detroit, Transforming Wellness and Wholeness, that emerged from Kara's activism and work at the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit in 2010. And it was at the U.S. Social Forum that Kara was part of organizing a healing justice practice space that the Allied Media Conference also started to organize thereafter. A few years later in 2012, the Allied Media Conference, came up with a set of principles. A few years after that, in the Bay Area, the Badass Visionary Healers, they reposted Kara's principles alongside the AMC's principles and then added to the list. And then one of my favorite kind of set of principles was recently released last year by Sins Invalid. Basically, to finally get at your question, I think at rock bottom, what healing justice provides, for me at least, is a framework for transforming wellness and wholeness, as Kara puts it, and really rethinking what it means to be healthy and unhealthy. So on the one hand, healing justice, points to the fact that oppression has material effects on us, on our minds, bodies, and spirits. And at the same time, it really uplifts wellness practices as a transformative response to the way that oppression materially impacts us. And for example, this past year, actually, I had the honor of participating in this retreat organized by Alexis Pauline Gumps and Alma Lavon in Austin, Texas, called Dark Sciences. And the retreat was about, how we can leverage basically our dreams in the service of healing justice. Healing justice does all this in part by drawing on, as I mentioned earlier, lived experiences, but also our embodied modes of theorizing and approaching issues like wellness, wholeness, healthiness, unhealthiness, and really thinking about the personal as being political. In healing justice movements, we often turn to the work of Black, Indigenous, and women of color feminisms as a canon from which we can pull useful concepts. And I guess the one last thing I would also add is that healing justice isn't new, and that the work of folks like Alondra Nelson and in her second to last book, Body and Soul, kind of shows us how health activism has always been a part of social movements. And, in Body and Soul is about the Black Panther Party's legacy of health activism. So the final thing I would add is that, healing justice is not new.
Do you have any advice for maybe how academics in particular can incorporate healing justice principles, either personally, so practices that we can do ourselves, but also maybe how departments or the structural aspects of academia can better incorporate healing justice principles?
Yes, I do. And this is something, obviously, I've been grappling with. I grappled with it throughout my graduate career because it was actually after the first year of graduate school that I acquired chronic illness. And it's something that I still grapple with now. And I think the first thing that comes to mind is this emphasis in academia on productivity. And it's so salient that even kind of critical POC-focused resources for academics really emphasize productivity in a kind of ableist way. And so I think one thing that we can do is transform our relationship to productivity and, even as we're working in spaces that privilege it. Privilege productivity in relation to writing over all else. So for me, this looks like, grounding myself in what my dear friend Kian Abadani calls crib time. So as a chronically ill academic who's also neurodiverse, this means that I move in slow motion because I have to. And so I've been thinking about and working with embracing my own pace versus kind of forcing myself to be productive in really ableist ways, if that makes sense. I've had to continually work on kind of emptying my need for a result and instead focusing on developing a flexible practice that allows me to be productive in a way that works for me.
It seems like there's some interesting connections to the slow professor movement that's been taking off lately. This a shared sense of wanting to critique or find an alternative to, exactly as you put it, that overwhelming emphasis on produce that academia is designed around, particularly these days, right? It seems like that's an increasing demand in comparison to previous decades. And yet the slow professor movement isn't inherently about healing justice per se, but it seems like there's some interesting connections there.
Absolutely. And, when I was a visiting scholar at the Science and Justice Research Center, the folks over there were thinking about slow science and what it means to work on issues related to science and justice across disciplines, but really take the time to actually build relationships. For example, with folks as part of what it means to do that work at the intersection of science and justice. And so I definitely think there's a relationship. And I think that, connecting that to healing justice more explicitly would look more like developing anti-ableist pace, but in a way that's situated and specific. So in a way that, for me, for example, resonates with my experience as a chronically ill femme of color, as a first-gen scholar activist.
So in addition to being a kind of rock star scholar and community activist yourself, you're also a graduate of the Ideas on Fire's grad school rockstar program, which is how we met originally, which is the group coaching program that we offer to kind of combine the lessons from progressive social justice movements with the practices that we find ourselves in academia. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the experience you had in the program. How have the skills and approaches that you learned help you in your subsequent work? And do you maybe have any advice for current enrolled rock stars or people who are contemplating the program?
Yes. Well, for people who are contemplating the program, my kind of advice is to enroll in it immediately. I loved the program, and another thing I wanted to mention in relation to your last question was about accessibility, and making our classrooms and academic events more accessible. And what drew me to the Rockstar program, and one of my favorite things about it, is that it was very accessible to me. It was, something that I could actually do, commit to and do. And can I share a few more things I loved about the program?
Yes, by all means.
Okay. Jumping on this topic of accessibility, another thing I really appreciated about the program is that it took a very kind of holistic approach to academic coaching. And so I learned a lot about different aspects of myself, and was able to work through those things in kind of all these different modes. There was also the opportunity to write out stuff for myself, but then share stuff on a blog and then comment on other folks' stuff. So there were all these different kind of ways that I could engage with the different tools that you shared with us. Those tools have actually been really helpful. And I do use Workflowy, for example, to this very day. And one of the things that I really took from the program were all those tools that you and the other participants shared. And also, the importance of having an accountability structure was something that I implemented from that point on and still have in my life. Thinking about different ways of approaching long-term writing projects, which, links back to my what I was sharing in response to your previous question about honoring my pace and redefining productivity for myself. So, learning how to divide things up into bite-sized pieces and work towards something gradually. Also, I loved that it was diverse, interdisciplinary, social justice oriented. I mean, that's something that I certainly wasn't getting from the kind of job market related or dissertation writing related offerings that my previous institution had available.
So you mentioned writing and kind of long-term writing projects, and you've written in a variety of publications. You've obviously written scholarship, you're working on a scholarly book, but you've also either been interviewed in or written pieces for a number of public or open access feminist, ethnic studies, and public health publications. For instance, you have pieces in the Feminist Wire. You mentioned your work with 1969, the Journal. How did you get involved in writing for those public or open access venues?
I got involved in writing for public open access web publications. And actually, when I was the executive editor of 1969, we made 1969 also public and open access. But I got involved with like the Feminist Wire really early on, I think, in maybe my first year of graduate school. And for me, it was and still is a way of being what my friend Alexis Pauline Gumps calls a community accountable scholar or a community accountable intellectual. And so on the one hand, it was, speaking of kind of like work ethic, it was a nice way to balance the more isolated and highly, or what can be a highly individualistic process of dissertation writing, and making it that process more communal. But more than anything, it was a way for me to basically share the research that I was conducting in the university with the community and just break that kind of university community boundary and also receive feedback. A few years ago, I published this piece on the Feminist Wire on cases of forced sterilization in California state prisons. And I wrote this piece, and within 24 hours, I received feedback on it from Justice Now, this community-based organization in the Bay Area. And so it's a way of also, it has always been a way for me to also receive critical, constructive feedback from community members, from community organizations who are doing work on the ground in relation to the issues that, I was researching in school.
That brings me to my favorite question that I get to ask people, which is the big question, the potentially scary question, but I think the most fun question. And that's your version of a better world. Obviously, this podcast focuses on projects and people that are imagining other worlds, that are imagining otherwise, right? So I'll ask you, what's that version of a better world that you're working towards when you write your scholarship, when you create your public writing, when you work on healing justice? What kind of world do you want?
Oh my goodness, I love this question too. I'm working towards, a world, a nonviolent world for all of us. And my work in particular focuses on the violence perpetuated through the medical industrial complex, which of course is related to all these other systems of these violent systems of oppression. And I think what I want to mention that's really important to me is the fact that it's not just that I'm working towards kind of like recovering certain groups of people into this like master narrative. So what I mean by that is yes, it's so important to make, healthcare, for example, affordable and accessible to everyone. And in particular to those who are most impacted by the medical industrial complex. And beyond that, I think what I'm always working towards is, as you said, imagining otherwise, imagining a world without insurance, for example. What would that actually look like? And it's something I think about every day, in part because it's something I have to deal with every day. And so I'm working on creating the conditions of possibility for another way to exist. And I think it's also important to mention that that other way already does exist. It's very much here and now, and I feel it on a day-to-day basis and enact it on a day-to-day basis. So I think, for example, like the work I did with the Healing Clinic Collective in the Bay Area, where we organized pop-up clinics in different neighborhoods throughout the East Bay that offered free alternative healthcare services. That is a way of enacting another world here and now. And I think that's also part of why in my research, I'm so drawn to literature and, try to uplift the ways in which folks are imagining otherwise through these creative genres. Yes, we can imagine other resolutions, other possibilities. And I think also we're enacting them every day on a day-to-day basis in small and large ways. What I just said reminds me of, and maybe this is a good place to wrap up my response to this question, but it reminds me a lot of what Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Imarisha have been saying about how, organizers and activists are the work that we do is very sci-fi. And they write about this in the introduction to Octavia's Brood, which they recently co-edited, and talk about how we're trying to create these alternative worlds all the time, and are creating them in the here and now, and that's an act of speculative fiction.
So many of our podcast guests have mentioned that book and those authors. So it seems like a very common inspirational thread that runs across a lot of the episodes, which is fantastic.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your version of Imagining Otherwise.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such an honor.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Check out our website at ideasonfire.net to listen to full episodes, read show notes, and see links to the people, books, and projects discussed on the show. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter to find out when new episodes are released and to get tips to help you rock your interdisciplinary career.